Hi, I'm Greg Brahe, and I'm an atheist. Intellectual honesty can be a scary thing. It means setting aside your pride, putting your most cherished beliefs on the line, and examining them with honest and open inquiry, looking at them from dissenting viewpoints and considering all of the evidence and all the options and admitting a possibility that you might be wrong. That's so scary, in fact, that people have cloistered themselves away. They've locked out dissenting opinions, shunned them, or worse, through almost all of human history. But the New Covenant Group is different. Join us Sundays at 6 o'clock for Inspiring Honesty, authentic inquiry between a believer and a non-believer on the questions that really matter.
I like the way that Greg is engaged. He's enthusiastic about this in a very real way, which is excellent. I think he's ready to deal with the issues, bring out what he perceives, and to be honest with you, I'm more than excited and ready to respond.
When I was first asked to be on the show, I have to be honest, it was a little daunting. I've never seen, and as far as I'm aware, there's never been an atheist in a hosting position on a regular show through a Christian broadcast. That's a lot of pressure. I need to really represent my side well, but I'm excited. I think that this is going to be a fantastic opportunity for some important conversations that never would have happened if the Christians stayed with the Christians and the atheists stayed with the atheists, and the theists stayed with the theists, and the Muslims stayed with the Muslims. The conversations need to be addressed from multiple angles.
Whatever there is to risk through genuine dialogue, it probably isn't worth having.
In polite society, there have always been things that are considered taboo. A person's faith is beyond question. It's beyond challenge. It's sacred. Well, I disagree. And the New Covenant Group has invited me to be part of their show where, for the first time ever, an atheist, myself, can sit down with a believer and have real conversations about the subjects that matter, subjects that have always been off limits before. Hi, and welcome to Inspiring Honesty. I'm your host, Greg Brahe, and I'm an atheist. Today I will be joined again by Bob Greaves, who has been the co-host with us for the last several weeks. And I'm excited to say I wasn't sure last week if he was going to be able to join us again. This week we know for sure that he will indeed be here to help host our first guest on the show. Our guest today is a man named Alan Darley. He is a teacher coming in from Nottingham, England. You need to have a little bit extra respect for him for that tonight. Where he is, it is midnight. He stayed out nice and late to do this show with us. So if he looks a bit tired, that's not just because he's been thinking about how amazing I am at debating all day. And to address debating, that is not the goal of the show today. We have invited Alan on to discuss some subjects that we have discussed in the past online, and to flesh them out a little bit more and to take some comments from the viewers. To give a little bit more of an introduction to Alan, he was born in Lincoln, England, and he gave me a bio for himself. So in his own words, home of a magnificent cathedral, the Magna Carta, and a rubbish football team. He says that he made a personal commitment to Christ at age 12 through the witness of a Sunday school teacher in a little Methodist church, and since he has continued to study and test out Christianity intellectually and experientially through his life. Whenever he has struggles, he says he goes back to the foundations to find them rock solid. In 2010, he graduated with a master's in philosophical theology, and is informally studying towards a PhD on the subject of meaningfulness of religious language. Now, that's a question that I have for Alan, and I will certainly bring up, is how you informally study for a PhD, because I think I should be there as well. He says that he is a qualified secondary school teacher, which in the States here, I would call that high school, students anywhere from 11 to 18 years old, and teaches in a state school in Nottingham. He also ran a course in 2009 on apologetics at his local church called Good Reasons to Believe. And that actually is how I have most of my correspondences with Alan, as well as he created a group on Facebook where we discuss these things by the same name. Alan says, again in his own words, I'll quote here, "I believe that Christianity is true and reasonable and is therefore relevant to every aspect of life. I'm delighted, therefore, to have the opportunity to discuss the question of morality and faith on tonight's show." So the question that I introduced a little bit last week and that we plan to open the show with today is the question, do you believe it is possible for morality to exist without it having a divine source or creator? The position that I take is obviously no. I don't know where Bob stands on this, but for Alan, he stands in the affirmative, saying that not only is God the source of morality, but that morality is impossible without a God. With that, I wanted to introduce first Bob, the co-host. Bob, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Good to be back. And I was so sad for a while there when I thought maybe I wouldn't be. But it's great to be with you again, Greg. Enjoyed many of the discussions we've had. I'm looking forward to having Alan on with us as well.
Between me and Alan.
Yeah, do you want me to come in? Yeah. Yeah, Greg and Bob, it's fantastic to be on the show this evening. Thank you for inviting me. It is a cold, dark night here in England. I wondered if I should film this from my bed, actually, but I thought I should make an effort. But it's great to meet you guys face to face after a lot of debates on Facebook. I must admit, I got a bit worried when Greg did a type and said that I was appearing on a love show tonight rather than a live show. But of course I do love you guys, and I want you to know that. So I'm particularly glad tonight to be speaking on the subject of the moral argument. And many people often say that they sometimes objected that the traditional arguments for God do not lead to the Christian God. But I think here we have an example of how each particular argument gives us a little bit more information about who that God is. So, the cosmological argument is to a cause of the universe, a transcendent, timeless, spaceless cause. The design argument points to an intelligent person who made the universe. And here with the moral argument, we see that God is personal and good. It's not, sometimes people say perhaps there's an evil designer, an evil God behind the universe. But the moral argument that we'll be unpacking tonight points to a source of goodness. And then we could follow that up with the historical evidence for Jesus, which would lead us into the Christian God. So this is part of a cumulative case, I think, which adds a rational basis for Christianity. Also, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, I'm inspired by the words of Immanuel Kant when he said that two things filled him with wonder. One was the starry skies above, and the other was the moral law within. And so these are two evidences that God exists, which Paul also talks about in the book of Romans, what we might call outside information, the external universe, and then this inside information within our consciousness and our conscience, which points to the existence of God. So coming back to the question that Greg raised there at the beginning, is it possible for morality to exist without it having a divine source or creator? I think I'd first like to bring a disclaimer to that about what I want to say here. I'm not saying that people with no belief in God are unable to live a moral life or to make moral choices, obviously that would be absurd and stupid to claim that.
Thank you.
I'm also not claiming that my personal morals are superior to anyone else's morals in the way I live them out. And obviously there's terrible examples in history of Christians committing atrocities, or so-called Christians committing atrocities. So I'm not arguing, therefore, that believers in God have always acted in a moral way. But I do want to argue that that atheism, and in particular scientific naturalism, can provide no intellectually adequate foundation for the existence of morals. That is, of objective morals. I mean, you could reduce morals to, say, personal inclinations or some sort of evolutionary survival byproduct. But if we're talking about objective morality, then I can't personally see how there could be a basis for that. If we mean by objective a morally binding set of laws, independent of what anyone thinks about them. Just over here in the UK at the moment, we've had a terrible incident where 2 women police officers were tragically gunned down and had a grenade thrown at them by someone who can only be described as evil. And I think that, this shows that intuitively, when we read our newspapers every day, we know that certain things are just morally abhorrent to us. And this is in accord with what I would say is a truth about the universe. There are moral truths about the universe, just as there are scientific truths and mathematical truths, independent of what we think about them. We can know them, or we could discover them through life. We don't invent them. And so if we took examples like slavery in the past, slavery is wrong, even though many people practiced it for a time, and we can then say that slavery didn't become wrong, it's always been wrong, but for some people that was the process of discovery. So for morality to be true, in this sense, God must exist. And I would make a bold claim as well here that when the atheist makes a moral statement, an objective moral statement, and acts within it, he is inadvertently demonstrating that God does, in fact, exist. I could unpack that some more, but I'll give you a chance to just come in.
I have a question here for you then.
Yeah.
You said objective morality, and I appreciate that you defined that right away. But before we jump into the whole moral argument, can you give me a loose definition or a very strict one, depending on what you feel is most appropriate, for what you mean when you say that God is the source of it? What is God to you?
God is the infinite personal God. His nature is good, and that is what grounds goodness in an objective reality. Goodness is not a human construct. We participate in that goodness, which is God himself. So Plato saw the form of the good as the ultimate value, and he was partly right, except that he saw that as some sort of impersonal idea, whereas it's better to have ideas existing in minds. And so God is, if you like, mind-like. And this is a better explanation for morals than matter. Atheism typically leads towards some sort of materialism or physicalism, and I can't see how logically mind can come from matter.
As a biologist, I can go into how that's believed to have happened, but I don't think that that's the subject of the show tonight. So I did want to say, if you said that and I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting what you said, but I wrote it down. It said God is good by nature. That was the words that you used. So you mentioned Plato. it does bring up the Euthyphro dilemma, I believe it's called, where
Yes, yes.
it's and I'm sure as a philosopher you're familiar with it, but is what is morally good commanded by God because it is morally good, or is it good because it's commanded by God?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because for Plato the answer was that God did things because they were good, and
you believe the opposite?
Yeah, that would. No, well, I would say the answer to the two horns of that dilemma is to say that God is his own goodness. God is the only being whose essence and existence are identical. He is his own existence. And so he doesn't, in a sense, have properties, but he is those properties.
So is it possible
God is not
for God to do
God
or
is not
order
subject to
something
some
that is not
higher
good?
law than himself. If God was subject to some higher law than himself, then that would be God. But neither is what he does arbitrary, because when he acts totally in accordance with his own nature. And the righteous God does righteousness, as it says in the Psalms.
So is it possible for God to do something that is not good? No matter, whatever the action of this God is. And I'm not going to say that God would do it if there is one, that it might be outside of that God's nature to ever act in such a way that is not good, or not what we would consider good. But say the Genesis account of the flood, where, objectively speaking, where women and children and infants were drowned arbitrarily. According to the story, and I believe that story to be mythological, not literal fact. I don't know where you stand on that, but in my opinion, that would not count as something that is morally good, to drown everybody but 8 people. But is it possible then? Am I simply mistaken that if that action were to have happened as it was laid out, that was wrong, or is it that it is wrong, and it was wrong that God did it, which is why God was said to have regretted doing it and vowed not to do it again?
I guess there's 2 issues here. One is the interpretation of the Old Testament, and the other is there a moral God? I personally believe both of those. I believe that the Old Testament is inspired and that God is good. I don't see any contradiction in that. The way I interpret the Old Testament is through the perspective of Jesus Christ. I'm a Christian, so I'm not a Jew, and so my hermeneutic of the Old Testament goes through what Jesus said. Jesus did affirm the flood, the story of Noah, and he spoke about it in the context of another judgment which came in AD 70, which was the destruction of Jerusalem, which he accurately predicted before it happened. So these are similar in terms of suffering that were caused by it. I guess our concept of justice, again, participates in God's nature, and we only see God's nature imperfectly by analogy. So our language about God is not univocal, but it's analogical.
So Bob, were you going to say something?
I don't know if we can perfectly understand God's justice, but we get a glimpse of it.
Yeah. The truth is I'm probably somewhere other than where both of you are, in that, of course, I would also agree with you, Greg, that the flood is an account that I don't perceive as even intended to be understood as literal. But at the same time, even addressing the initial question, is it possible for there to be morality without God? And as a theist, there's a part of me that thinks, well, without God, we wouldn't even be here to ask the question. So it's a sense in which
it does beg the question a touch.
Yeah, it does, and So that I would also, however, I would see that the nature of morality, as even Alan was talking about it, that even when he as he said, that even when an atheist does that which is a moral decision, he is in some ways acknowledging God. I don't know if that's true, but I see something in there that I would have to agree with, and that is that I do believe personally that our very nature as beings, as human beings, is something that is part of the image of God, and part of that design involves a particular nature of ourselves that requires a certain level of empathy. And I think that anybody who possesses this capacity for empathy does so because this is a capacity created in us by God. And that I do think that a person exercising that empathy and thinking it through and being open to the kinds of feelings it produces is very capable of making moral choices without ever knowing or understanding how that dynamic came about or attributing it to God. So I don't see God as essential to be understood for a person to make a moral choice, but I just don't see
Yes.
how we could do any behavior, let alone moral behavior or immoral behavior, if it weren't for the fact that we were brought into existence by God.
Well, and to
Yeah, I
address
agree
the
there.
begging the question side of it, I did want to say that my intention in asking this question is something a touch more along the lines of, is the fact that there seems to be objective standards of morality a form of proof or evidence of a God. And I think that is if Alan, can you agree that that's sort of where you're coming from with that?
Yes, and I think another aspect of apologetics is in defending a position is it's a bit like there's different trees in the forest, different philosophical trees, if you like, alternative positions. And if we chop down every tree in the forest and there's only one standing, then that's the one that we go for. And there's not always many possible options, not many possible trees in the forest. There's pantheism, there's atheism, there's theism. Now, under scientific naturalism, I cannot see how there can be objective moralities for another important reason, which is that scientific naturalism sees a human being as basically a material object or a physical object, subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. And if this is true, then there can be no genuine free will. And if there's no genuine free will, then you cannot be a moral agent. God.
Say that again, Greg.
Isn't it also true, though, that would be the case with an omniscient God that knows the future as well as the past and the present, that there cannot be such a thing as free will? I mean, there can be arguments made on that of every...
They can, but I think they're fallacious in that the fact that God knows something is different from saying he determines something. I mean, I know what you're saying to me right now, but I don't determine what you're saying to me.
Well,
God
knows these things timelessly.
Now, do not have determined it in a way.
Could I say something, by the way? No, I don't want to interrupt what's going on. It seems to me that the question, and I certainly don't, I believe in freedom of choice, not free will, but which is slightly different. But I would say this, that for God to foreknow anything, even if he doesn't determine it, whatever does allow him to foreknow it is also that which determines it. I don't see how you can have foreknowledge without determinism, even if you're not sure where to assign the determinism. And I personally don't see God as omniscient. I see him as knowing a great deal, but this omniscient concept is something that was introduced to Christianity after Scripture had its say to our church. And I really see it as more of Western thinking. It doesn't work for me. And then when it comes to the question of morality, if we're going to work that in, I think I'm finding myself somewhere between the two of you in that I see the mechanics, the dynamics of it as created, but I see that the creation now set into what it is as morality isn't something that God can even defined. God, who knows our nature, would know what is moral, but it's entirely because of the fact that it's what our nature needs. If our nature didn't require it, God couldn't either.
So I promised Alan here that I would not make this a debate format, and I'd focus mainly on asking him questions. But I do feel that it's necessary for me to respond in a way to a question that was implicitly asked by Alan, in how it can be possible for a scientific naturalist to believe in morality. And my answer to that breaks down thus. I'll try to keep it brief. I believe that it is quite evident through all of human history that there has been not a single action that has been universally condemned by every individual and even every culture. As a matter of fact, every single action you can imagine has not only been not condemned, has been considered morally right in some context or another, whether that means killing, rape, as in many situations has been considered not only acceptable but the right thing to do in some cultures. Cannibalism, pedophilia, these are all things that in modern times are generally considered to be morally reprehensible by everybody. But there has not been a single action that has been universally hated by everybody. And I think that leads to the obvious conclusion that we are not all imprinted with a moral blueprint that we're all aware of. We don't know morality from the beginning. I would say that our morality... Oh, go ahead.
Or else that it's a little more sophisticated and complicated than that. We all seem to not only recognize that we all have this... Most people think they're making moral choices, but when people make choices they justify that others would regard as immoral, there's usually some perspective involved of survival, of tradition. There's usually something going on that complicates it, and we don't know to what degree that has actually short-circuited it. So I don't know that it necessarily means that it shows there is no objective layer, other than to say that we are... that we're a developing, evolving race in terms of what we're discovering to be the real impact of our choices, and therefore learning over time in history to make better choices.
I understand that, but I did want to say that I think that from that reality and the fact that you're right, that we're learning, we've changed, we've grown. I think that more and more things have become evident, and it's my argument is that there can be such a thing as objective morality, things that are right and wrong, and they can be derived from reality and from reality as I know it, scientific naturalism, in the fact that there's this subjective morality that every individual holds, and as Bob pointed out, every individual believes that they are doing what is right. But I go by the non-contradiction principle, the fact that it's in both reality and testing, things cannot contradict each other, but also in morality, that it shows that you are acting in an immoral way if you violate your own personal morality. The biggest thing I can say deriving from that is that, for me, I think it's evident everybody has their own personal morality, and they do not overlap 100% for any two individuals. They're derived from culture, from education, from personal experience, subjective experience. And whenever I act in a way that violates another person's individual morality, a way that they would not want me to act, I am implicitly violating my own personal morality. I'm being inconsistent. I'm contradicting myself because I would not want a person to do that to me. So in doing that, I am showing an inconsistency within my own personal morality. And from that, I think we can derive the platinum rule. The idea that instead of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the fact that they have a subjective morality means that we should do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And that can be objectively stated, given that not doing so would be the equivalent to violating my own personal morality by going from
Sounds
there.
good. Sounds good, but I don't think it would work. I mean, if there's something you would really feel I should do to you, but it's something I can't in good conscience do, even if I'm just terribly mistaken or mentally ill. I just don't think. I think the platinum rule might be something worth considering, but. It certainly has some involvement. But by the way, going back to one of the things that was said before, we talked about the naturalist, scientist, and all that. I would object to say that I don't think there's any such person who exists, because every scientist I know is also a human being, and I don't think any of them stop being a human being. I think science is what they focus on. It is how they employ themselves. But at the same time, when they make decisions, even as a scientist, they can never escape the context of being human. And I would say that if they think they're just operating on a scientific basis only, they're actually living in the design God gave them and not knowing it. And
I think that's a very important point, Bob. That for something to be true, it must be livable in some sense. So if scientific naturalism is impossible to live by in its logical conclusions, namely that we're just a machine and don't have any genuine free will, then it must be false. And you're right, because people don't consistently live as if that's the case. And therefore they're once again demonstrating that they are in fact God's creature in God's world. Well, back to the objective reality, what Bob said, so what Greg said earlier about absolutes. So there's a difference between absolutes and objective. And all we need to say there is, in a particular situation, if we say that a particular situation is either right or wrong, we're saying that it's right or wrong independent of whether we think it is or not. And for that to be the case, there must be a God. That would be the point. That would be the position I would take on that.
I would see morality as being far more holistic, in a sense where it's a very messy thing, that it involves all of these things. It involves our awareness, our level of development, and even the sense where Scripture talks about how to whom much has been given, much is required. I would even think that there's room here for us to not to say that there are not things that are innately and automatically and absolutely creating horrible outcomes, but that in a sense our moral struggle somehow involves our personal participation. And so who we are as a person, what we understand, what we see, has to somehow come into this. And not that I want morals to be loosey-goosey and so situational that I can just define situations any way I want so as to live any way I can thereby justify. I do think that, unfortunately, there just is no way for anyone to live except within a context of their own coherent perception. And we all live there, even when we are making mistakes we don't understand. And that's one reason why I think that, for me, even redemption in Christ involves our growing up into the full measure of the fullness of Christ. And we don't have to know right now what that's going to mean. Just as a kernel of corn in the ground does not have to know, as it were, what it means to become a cornstalk. It will, because this is its destiny, and our destiny.
So are you saying that morality is inevitable?
I'm saying that our moral development is that. I mean, nobody, as you mentioned, there's no one moral code or behavior that has enjoyed full condemnation or has not at some point enjoyed some sort of appreciation. And sad to say, human history is just coated with all sorts of horrific things. But I do think that we are headed towards a destiny where the ways in which we miss the mark are going to be made clear to us so that we can participate in a morality that truly allows love to be what it is and to reign. And I see this as our design, and I see this as the activity of God, and I see this as being what each of us are struggling to work with, and that the only reason we're even having a discussion of this nature now is because, well, we're kind of in mid-process, and we don't really clearly see the end yet, even if we believe it's coming.
And Bob, I appreciate that perspective. I do want to say I feel we're getting a little bit off the initial subject, and I wanted to get the opportunity for Alan to speak a little bit more. We did just get a viewer comment, the viewer comment, it actually harkens back to the question that I'd asked directly to Alan. So to give you the opportunity to speak again here, first of all, the viewer question was you had not directly addressed whether you believed the flood was a moral act or not, Alan.
I believe it was a moral act in that God is just, and if he didn't get angry, that would mean that he would be morally indifferent. So it's not logically inconsistent to have an angry God.
But is anger particularly wrath, out of anger, a morally just position? Is that not inconsistent for a God who has wrath as one of the 7 deadly sins?
Well, God's wrath is only analogous to our wrath. God's wrath isn't capricious or subjective, fickle.
It's far more devastating, I'd argue.
Fickle emotions. Yes. Yeah. But we need to also bear in mind that the wrath of God was completely absorbed into himself when he took on flesh and became a man and died on the cross. So that is the answer to the wrath of God, that he took it on himself, and that's his love for us, the cross.
Which is where
the moral law argument actually naturally leads.
Let's use a little bit more specific example then. When we talk about the actions of God, the flood is earlier in the Bible. If we get into the book of Exodus, though, we can talk about the plagues of Egypt, specifically the final plague, where the angels came. I don't remember if it was angels directly or the Holy Spirit or what was said to have done it, but came and killed the firstborn child of every household. Very, very direct infanticide by an action by God. Was that right? Was that and that was to prove a point. He hardened the heart of Pharaoh so that Pharaoh couldn't even. And we're assuming here that the Bible or the actions are accurate, the stories are accurate, but or at least portraying a truth about God, the morality of God, even if the story itself is allegorical. This is a God who intentionally made a person not want to succumb to his wishes so that he could show off how powerful he is, essentially, and punish these people with a series of plagues that killed all kinds of people, including infants, intentionally and directly. Was that moral?
God had a desire to save the Egyptians as well as the Israelites, and the plagues in a way were a judgment on their gods to show that, to give them an opportunity to turn away from those destructive tendencies.
Could I interject here? I think that although Al and I don't possess the same view on this, I think that people who do see it the way Alan do are actually trying to present what they see as an honest conundrum, that God cannot wink at sin and must judge it, and yet when he judges it, the outcome of that is also horrible. And so there's this kind of catch-22 that God is in, that he, in his morality, must uphold, and yet this catch-22 is resolved in the atonement of Christ, who, in taking that wrath upon himself, now offers an opportunity for this example to work so that we can nonetheless recognize the validity of judgment while at the same time finding the grace to pass by it. I believe that's the kind of concept that they're dealing with. And so it's not as if they're saying, oh yeah, God can kill Egyptians and he can kill everybody but 8 people, and this is perfectly fine and I'm okay with it. There is a recognition that these were devastating and horrific events, and yet, of course, in Noah's day, as the scripture would say, thought of every man's heart was evil continually, and it is as if God and him must play his hand if he's a just God. And so I think that in many ways they see this not as an joyous and just a thing, well, okay, there you go, it was moral, it's okay, I'm fine with it, how are you? That's not the kind of thing that Alan is saying. Alan, am I putting words in your mouth, or is this kind of the concept that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I think that's a fair description. Yeah.
So the intention is justice, and if something bad must happen in sort of a retributive fashion, then it's acceptable as long as the Christ allegory is, or the Christ story is accurate, and that there was the atonement for it in that nature. Am I following?
Yeah, I think the central point is here: is there such a thing as justice in the universe? And on atheism, there isn't really justice in the universe. It's just a human construct. And however we interpret the Old Testament is really a different issue. It's a separate issue of hermeneutics, which maybe requires a different session.
That's true.
But there's no real basis for international justice, for example, on atheism. Because how can objective justice exist? On what is the foundation
of it? Justice is a very
it?
different question there. Sorry, I feel like I cut you off there.
And yet we all intuitively believe it, that there must be such a thing as justice. Even Jacques Derrida, who tried to deconstruct all truth statements, all objective truth statements, once he got to justice, he felt he couldn't deconstruct it. He said, we must live as if we're going to be judged by a future community that will be free. And I think that in that respect, he was still bound to his Jewish roots. His philosophy didn't allow that, but his Jewish roots were still coming through, saying, yes, there is such a thing as justice. So this is something we have inherited from the Judeo-Christian tradition. I mentioned before I'm from Lincoln. Lincoln holds one of the original manuscripts of Magna Carta, on which the principle of Western society that the king is himself subject to law comes from. But this concept itself has been given to us from the Judeo-Christian tradition, going back to Moses, traced through the Reformation with the scriptures, etc. As we're losing that consensus in society today, there's a threat of tyranny and of arbitrary rules that are being applied. And so we need to acknowledge this heritage. The rule of law is inseparable from the moral law, and you can't have a moral law without a moral lawgiver.
I would argue that it is possible to have a moral law without a moral lawgiver. I mean, that's what I had said before. We're getting a couple of viewer comments that I'll get to in just a moment, so thank you, viewers, for chiming in here. But the moral law that I argued for was essentially summed up in the golden rule, the platinum rule. But as Bob pointed out, it is possible for the platinum rule to violate your own moral principles, because, say, I asked you to kill me, and you don't want to kill me, you believe that to be immoral, then you should not do unto me as I would have you do unto me in that respect. That would violate your own personal morality. And it's tricky because it works both ways. Me forcing you to kill me would be violating your own personal morality. A friend of mine led me to what is called the non-aggression principle. which I believe is probably the best way to interpret the objective morality that I believe can be derived through individuals having their own subjective morality, is that it is objectively wrong to act aggressively towards another person, whether that means to physically, violently do something to them, or through coercion, deception, or any other nature to cause them to violate their own personal morality. Would you agree or disagree that is
on what basis are you saying that that's true? Are you saying that that's true analytically by definition, or on what basis
are you saying that
it's true
and that can be derived through the personal morality that people have through sort of the proof that I went through earlier of, since everybody has their own personal morality.
Why isn't that subjective then?
Yeah.
It's
inconsistent.
It sounds good, but I don't think it works.
I can't see how that would be morally binding on anyone in an objective way.
It would be morally binding on themselves. Anybody who holds anything to be moral or immoral, if you are not an amoral person, it means that you have your own understanding of morality, your own opinions based on morality, and what is right and what is wrong, and you act according to those opinions.
That's right.
Therefore,
we've got opinions, unless there's an objective morality, which is
that's true.
Possible.
But anybody holding those opinions objectively holds those opinions. It can be stated that these people hold moral opinions. Is that an objective or a subjective statement?
Well, that's the description of what they hold. But if you to say that there's a standard independent of them, then what is the basis of that? And that's what is meant by objective morality: is a standard which is independent of somebody's opinions. And even atheist philosophers, some key atheist philosophers like Sartre, Nietzsche, Marx, Zizek, they've all agreed that if God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Nietzsche said God is dead, and if God is dead, all moral values, objective moral values, die with him. That was why you thought that it was our duty to create our own set of values based on a Darwinistic ethic, the will to power, which had devastating effects, as we know, across Europe 50 years later.
You're right. I mean, there have been some massive things done in the understanding that morality will end. But I did want to get to, first of all, we have about 5 minutes left in the show. So if there are any ends, final points
can I come in with a positive thing?
I'm sorry?
Can I come in with a positive thing to close?
Sure. Let me just there's a couple of viewer comments here, and then there's one thing I wanted to pin you down to as well. So,
all right, okay.
The first thing I'm going to see what I can pin you down here with, and this is to address the viewers. When Alan was first invited on the show, he and I had contacted one another, discussed the option, and he was initially under the impression that it may be a formal debate. And Alan, this is my opportunity. I wanted to invite you to a formal debate at some point in the future. This has been a discussion that's been very free-flowing, but I think that the format of having a moderated debate with an independent third party and times might be a fantastic opportunity for you and I to discuss some of these issues, or a different issue that maybe we could take a poll from the viewers, what they'd like to see. I don't know, but would you be interested in doing something of that nature in the future?
Yeah, I'd definitely be interested in that. That sounds a good plan. Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can set that up in the future then. I just wanted to get the opportunity to pin you down to it since we have this recorded. But then the other thing I wanted to do before we wrap up here is that there are a couple viewer comments that I didn't get to. One said that I think that it was not moral, specifically referring to, I believe, still the flood, if God is love. And then the viewer made the comment, and he is love. Therefore, I can derive from that they meant it must be true. Another one said drowning people, including babies and animals, is not moral or good and never will be. And a final comment I see here is, I see what Greg is saying. For example, nobody generally wants to be stabbed. Therefore, it's objectively sound to assume that we should not stab others. And that one, I just wanted to make a point that I don't actually believe that to be true. It can be objectively stated that people hold their own subjective morality. And everybody does that. So if somebody wants to be stabbed and you want to stab somebody and you can make that, you can find one another, great. You'll make each other happy by you being the stabber and them being the stabbee. And there is absolutely nothing morally wrong with that. What is morally wrong is forcing anybody to act in a way that is contrary to their own personal morality, whether that is through aggression, coercion, or any other thing of that nature. So that's my point there. And Alan, with that, I wanted to go right back to you with any comments you wanted to make on those or closing comments.
Yeah, I think it still misses the point that you can't, as David Hume said, jump from the is to the ought. It's a category mistake to confuse those two.
There's also a difference between ought and ought not.
Beg your pardon?
There's a difference between saying that what you should not do and what you should do. We've not quite gotten deep enough, I think, to say.
Well, if we just describe what people want
versus what is bad.
It's just a description of what people want. It doesn't tell us what they should do, which is a different category. And on naturalistic scientism, all we've got is a description of socio-biological processes that don't actually inform us what we should do. But the positive point I wanted to end on was that on this theist view, we're guaranteed that evil will in fact be defeated in the end because it is morally accountable. So the old dilemma of the problem of evil set by Epicurus and Hume, if God is all powerful, he can stop evil, and if he's all loving, he wants to. Under theism, we can turn that problem into a promise, and we can say, because he's all powerful, he can stop evil. Because he's all loving, he will. So there's a guarantee that evil will be defeated in the future, and we've already had a foretaste of that in the resurrection of Jesus, a historical event in time and space. There's no guarantee of that under atheism. You just have to put up with it. And there's no way in any case of
I'm sorry, I do have to cut you off with that. I have about 30 seconds left here to say thank you for being on the show. We've really appreciated it. And I hope that you'll join us again in the future. The 50 minutes is simply not enough time to discuss these things. Next week, I do have a different guest lined up. I'm not sure Joey's even aware of this one yet, our producer, so we'll have to get that worked out. But his name is Nick Albertini. He'll be joining us. He is a complex system. I'm sorry, I don't want to put a label on exactly what he does, but he from what I understand, is a mathematician of sorts, understands complex systems theory to a level that he believes he has devised a way that the existence of a God, not the Christian God, but a God, can be objectively proven and testable. So he'll be joining us next week. And Alan, we will have to set up a time for you to come join us again. This has been a fantastic opportunity. And we will let the viewers know. Emails are a great opportunity, or text messages. Let us know what you might want to see debated in the future or discussed on an informal format. So thank you for joining us, Bob. Thank you as well.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Have a great night. This has been Inspiring Honesty, and join us next week at 6 o'clock.